Economic Armageddon.
Start again, Joe.
Economic Armageddon.
Economic Armageddon.
Yes.
That's today's show.
9/11 times 1,000. No. Yeah, well, yeah, it is.
At the end of last show, you gave a 10-minute explanation, which
Was it 10 minutes?
I can't even remember because my head was kind of stuffed with the cold at the time.
With the Omicron.
The Deltacron is called now.
Deltacron, yeah.
Yeah, our last show was actually on something else, mainly about COVID and mass psychosis, mass transformation, whatever they call it.
Whatever.
That got banned on YouTube, which means we can't stream on YouTube today. That's why we're on Facebook.
Banned, yeah.
The show got banned.
And we have a ban until tomorrow, right? Or yeah.
Something like that. They said it's 7 days, but they meant whatever.
They meant whenever we decide that you're...
So we couldn't live stream today on YouTube, so that's why we're late starting now. But we are on Facebook.
Amazing. It's amazing to be on Facebook.
So, yeah, that 10 minutes, though, was... It linked everything together. And in the meantime, what we had in mind at the time was Ukraine and the pressure against Russia coming through Ukraine. Mm-hmm. In the meantime, Kazakhstan has exploded.
Yeah.
So...
just this week, yeah.
I think it started, the first protests were last Sunday, 2nd January. Mm-hmm. And within 2 days, it was, fires burning at the presidential palace, at the main broadcaster in the country, at the parliament. There were people running around with guns. Mm-hmm. There were masses of people on the streets. At this point, now, a week in, I say 4,000 people have been detained in Kazakhstan. That's according to their own government. They didn't stop there were no more updates at the point where they said 18 of their police and military had been killed. Mm-hmm. They don't have a figure for how many civilians were killed. Civilians, which must include armed people.
A couple of dozen, maybe something similar.
So the country looked like it was teetering. It went from calm to teetering in the space of a few days.
Back to calm, relative.
Back to relative calm. I'm looking at live updates on Sputnik, and yeah, shit's still happening. But yeah, as soon as the Russian and other countries in the CSTO organization, that's the former Soviet states, basically, sent in troops on Thursday.
Well, yeah.
It calmed down.
Yeah, mainly Russia, though.
It's still tense, but...
I mean, to be honest about it, I mean, obviously the CSTO is a Russia-led organization of those former Soviet states that stands basically along its southern border, and it was done specifically back in
Belarus and Armenia.
Yeah, but it was done.
But it's Russian troops,
right? And that organization is Russian-led and organized by Russia for a very specific reason, which is to protect Russia's borders, basically protect those countries and protect Russia's borders from Western imperialism, let's say. That's the only reason for it really existing, essentially. Of course, it's got economic factors and all that kind of stuff, but generally it's a security organization, kind of like a little mini NATO for...
a mini NATO, and the Kazakh government said, we have a collective security treaty. We're invoking, similarly to NATO, invoking this article, which invites troops from the other member states to come in. Now, the one catch I heard in that, not necessarily from a critic, someone who would be skeptical of it, from the get-go, was, well, that's in the event of the country being overrun by a foreign threat. Whereas, to all appearances, this is a domestic situation, and should that really have happened? He just threw that as a question.
Yeah.
I think in their official
depends what you call
request to invite Russian troops, they tacked in a clause that, we don't know where these people come from.
Well, they've said since that they've made the claim that they're been funded from abroad, basically. Just give people an overview. Put up the Kazakh-Ukraine map just as a teaser introduction to just, where you are, what you're doing, what's going on here geographically. There's Kazakhstan on the right, obviously, and Ukraine. We've included Ukraine there on the left. You can see that, we'll get into Ukraine a little bit as we go on, but obviously Ukraine right there on Russia's borders, on its western border, and then there's a little relatively thin piece of Russian territory between Ukraine and the borders of Kazakhstan. So you can imagine if there was two serious kind of issues on Russia's borders that involved Russia in Kazakhstan and in Ukraine, then that's a bit of a headache, a political headache. From a geopolitical perspective, it's a problem. There's the rest of the kind of stands below Kazakhstan, Uzbekistan, Kyrgyzstan, Tajikistan, Turkmenistan, and like you mentioned, Armenia. Is Armenia on the map there? Armenia didn't get a mention.
It's left of Azerbaijan there.
It's just
between Turkey and Azerbaijan.
And then Belarus, obviously above Ukraine. So the main city is far right, bottom left, just above, near the border of Kyrgyzstan. How do you pronounce that? Kyrgyzstan. The main city, Almaty, is 2 million people. There's only 20 million people in Kazakhstan. It's about 2/3 the size of Australia. It's a massive country.
I've seen it overlaid on Europe. It's like the whole of the EU.
Yeah, but only 20 million people. 2 million in the main city in Almaty in the bottom right-hand side. So yeah, basically, just to get to the point, this uprising, kind of rioting, whatever you want to call it, fairly serious over a very short period of time. Very well organized, even though internet was shut down, which is usually why these grassroots revolt, usually how they communicate with each other. It's done, a lot of it's done via the internet. The internet was shut down. The main violent rioters were able to continue to communicate with each other. Apparently, some people said they had kind of like satellite radios or something like that. So there's a lot of evidence to suggest that these were people who were it was well planned, well in advance. They had very specific targets to attack. They attacked the kind of media stations, the main government buildings in different places,
and police stations.
And police stations, obviously, they were apparently well armed, had a lot of weapons and stuff. So it's not your average grassroots uprising about the price of gas, for example. Apparently, a lot of people in Kazakhstan, most people who drive cars, and most people who drive cars use LPG. Liquefied petroleum gas, because it's cheaper or whatever, and the prices went up, doubled since last year or whatever, and this was supposedly the reason, the official Western media narrative as to why they were, why people were rioting. Of course, there's other issues in it, like as in every country. There's probably a lot of political corruption. I mean, there's only one party effectively in Kazakhstan.
Yeah.
But of course, and to Western ears, that suggests, well, it's obvious why people would rise up then. Only one party? That's horrific. How can they live under that? They must be really annoyed at only having one political party, a dictatorship, right? But, that's a myopic Western view of the world. They think everything should mirror Western values, basically. They don't. The rest of the world doesn't. A lot of the rest of the world doesn't. So we don't have enough time to get into that, obviously, but the argument that it was some kind of mass grassroots uprising clamoring for democracy and have had enough of 2 decades of dictatorship and or probably more like 3 decades of dictatorship since the Soviet Union doesn't make any sense. It doesn't fit this picture. The picture of what actually happened doesn't fit with that narrative. Basically, it does suggest. If you put up the RT article, for example, one evidence, the first one on media text. One thing that you see from major media organizations from Western governments in response to attacks on the media. One big thing they always they use to attack governments they don't like is their suppression of media, and especially when there's some kind of anytime there's attacks in the media, basically, because it's a core aspect of the West's freedom, right, of Western democracy is freedom of the press, right? So any attacks anywhere in the world on the media is seriously clamped down on by, or seriously criticized by Western governments and Western media. That happened in Kazakhstan over the course of this week, where the media offices were attacked and journalists were abused and arrested, or not arrested, but kind of held captive, and there wasn't a peep out of Western democracies or Western media organizations about that. So you put it all together, and you can see that this wasn't it fit the picture of a kind of Western-backed
color revolution,
where they, well, we can get into the other thing as well. Well, we know as well the, I don't have the link here exactly, but a major part of the outcome of this, or the response by the Kazakh government, was to arrest a kind of high-level politician. He was a former Mazimov, is his surname.
Yeah.
Arrested him and accused him of treason, and there will probably be others along with that. So that again points to something going on within government, where a certain section or certain part of the Kazakh government had been compromised and was facilitating this kind of attempted coup or attempted overthrow of the regime, or just embroidering the country in kind of chaos, basically. You know what I mean? Probably with the idea of, in terms of Western government, particularly American, British attempts to overthrow, stage coups and overthrow sitting governments in countries they don't like. The first part of the process usually is that they embroil the country in a kind of conflict or chaos, right? With the hope of that leading up to, or putting international pressure then on the country for the violent response of government to peaceful demonstrators, blah blah blah, and then the government becomes illegitimate. It has to leave under international pressure, but not so much under international pressure, but usually under the kind of the violence and the armed groups that have been funded and supported by Western governments in that country. They're the ones who ultimately cause governments to flee, because they flee for their lives, basically. That's what happened in Ukraine in 2014, and we'll get into that in a minute. So anybody who's looked at this and who knows the history of Western-backed colour revolutions in different places around the world, and even before colour revolutions, just CIA-backed coups around the world all throughout the Cold War period, immediately recognise this, especially if you understand the geopolitical context in which it's happening. You understand this is very likely in some way or other, British or American or both, backed over a fairly long period of time, building up the details and the infrastructure, let's say, within the country in order to implement this kind of a riot or revolt. So that's pretty much what happened. Why? Well, they do it because they can. Generally speaking, they do it because they don't like, for one reason or another. For one geopolitical reason or another, they don't like or want to cause a problem for the government in that country, ideally to remove it. But often in this particular context, it would have a direct relationship to America's geopolitical intentions towards Russia. Obviously, as we just saw on the map there, Kazakhstan on the border with Russia. If you create a problem in Kazakhstan, if you can kind of have a successful coup, get rid of the government, install maybe a bunch of Muslim extremists, who knows, anybody other than the existing government, because the existing government is aligned with Russia. So you want to get rid of them and get anybody else in that you can control, that's aligned with the West, essentially. And you just cause a problem for Russia, because Russia, first and foremost, Kazakhstan is a buffer, a buffer state. All around Russia's borders, they've either got sea, or they've got countries that they want to keep either friendly with Russia or at the very least neutral. When you have a country that is antagonistic towards you from Russia's point of view, right on your border, that's a red line in the current geopolitical climate and context. And that relates to Ukraine, obviously, but in terms of Kazakhstan and those other stands along Russia's south central border, they're all buffer states, and they have to remain, from Russia's perspective, they have to remain friendly. And it would be a kind of it would be a benefit, let's say, geopolitically benefit to America to turn those countries to being anti-Russian.
Yeah. At the same time, there are a lot of videos of a lot of people in the streets.
Yeah.
Considering the small population in this country, considering the amount of gunfire and violence we've seen, there's Kiev sort of type stuff coming out where police lines protecting buildings have been run over by apparently civilians. They just ran through them, and then they have a wave of people on foot soldiers behind them to back them up and to challenge and just take the place. There's video of people being shot at. They're unarmed, but they overwhelm police and take the guns off them. It's I just want to sort of play devil's advocate here and not discount completely that there seems to be some seething undercurrent or several. For example, one possible one that you won't hear mentioned for different reasons in the media is that Kazakhstan as a country went full COVID. Mandatory vaccines, I think, QR codes to get into restaurants, the whole 9 yards. That's kind of a seething undercurrent everywhere, from Switzerland to Guadeloupe to, the North Pole at the moment. So how easy it is in this overall climate to provoke and to press go on well-laid plans, as you suggested. But those well-laid plans will only ever there'll be a minority, You might, typically what might have happened in the before times, as CNN puts it, is like what happened in the attempted coup d'etat and overthrow of Erdogan in 2016. We had a well-organized plan. I'm pretty sure the later figures produced by the Turks is probably in the ballpark where they said we've arrested and questioned at least around 18,000 people of direct or indirect involvement in what took place. And then the main reason that failed was not the failure of organization or military planning. It got to the point where Erdogan was in the air in semi-holding pattern with a view to fleeing. And he could only come down once there were enough people that came out on the streets and threw themselves in front of tanks. Some 200 to 300 people died by taking on armed people with no weapons. So it required the opposite conditions. Imagine now if you had to do that to Turkey today. I'm not sure of the situation in Turkey vis-a-vis going full COVID, but let's imagine they have something like that. You would have more chances of success because of a seething undercurrent from ongoing issues.
Yeah, it depends on the country. Certainly in any country around the world. Again, it depends. It's very specific. There's no one size fits all. Obviously, it depends on the specifics within the country and the culture and the temperament of the population.
Kazakhstan is majority Muslim.
It is,
which is another current you can see how it's over the years of the war on terror and all the stuff and the radicalization of Muslims. That's another thing that the state there has had to keep an eye on and keep a lid on.
For sure,
We know that two of the cops, well, there's no reason to doubt the official reports anyway, they said that two of the police were decapitated. That's a marker of a Muslim fanatical element to this.
Yeah, definitely. I'm not saying there aren't. There obviously are, issues within in Kazakhstan in terms of the people's unhappiness with government, but people generally speaking will put up with a lot of shit unless they're up to the point they can't take it anymore, but it does. So I'm not discounting the fact that there's obviously discontent among the population with the Kazakh government, the fact that there's there's no opposition party basically of any note, and also COVID puts people on edge, and also but the main thing that was mentioned is kind of double increase in gas prices and liquefied petroleum gas prices for the cars,
which is gas.
Yeah,
and that's interesting,
right? But again, that'll make people unhappy in certain places. Some people, not everybody, some people in some places, they'll be willing to get out in the streets. Maybe they already had been out in the streets. For example, if you look at the Kaz JPEG, this is an interesting. This is an alert from the U.S. mission in Kazakhstan. It's sent around to all, sent around from the U.S. State Department, but sent specifically to the U.S. mission in Kazakhstan, talking on December 16th, saying that there was an event, the opposition party, which is the Democratic Choice for Kazakhstan, which is probably a Western-funded, NGO type, supported new democratic party in Kazakhstan. They have no real representation because they're not allowed to, because Kazakhstan is a one-party state. But anyway, this party that doesn't really, like I said, have any representation in Kazakhstan, or doesn't represent very many people, at least not officially, had planned a demonstration on December 16th, and it was banned by the government. They're banned as an extremist group. So on December 16th, the US State Department knew and was telling its officials in the embassy in Almaty and Kazakhstan, warning them about possible disruptions, possible protests and riots, and a dangerous situation on December 16th. And none of this is at least 2 weeks before anything actually happened. And they mentioned at the bottom, actually, talk about the likelihood of smaller demonstrations are possible. Demonstrators possibly gather in front of the Holodomor monument. Demonstrators in Almaty and another town. They say non-sanctioned demonstrations usually end with mass arrests. Embassy personnel have been instructed to avoid the gatherings and protests. Even demonstrations intended to be peaceful can turn confrontational and escalate into violence. You should avoid demonstrations and exercise caution in the vicinity of large gatherings or protests. They talk a little bit further down, I think. Oh no, just above there, as well as internet network outages. So they had, this is eyes on the ground, right? Eyes and ears all over the place. The US State Department's eyes and ears all over the place, knowing that this was planned. Did they know it was planned? Because they've probably given a lot of money to this particular group, this democratic, new democratic political party in Kazakhstan. But the point being, yes, there's an undercurrent of discontent among certain sections of the population for different reasons. One discontent, one problem that unites a lot of poorer people, obviously, is a double increase, a doubling of the price of gas over a period of several months. That'll get you out in the street and protest and stuff. But where does the sudden extreme violent intent and organisation come from, to the point where the government is threatened, over gas prices? You talk about COVID and stuff. I mean, look at European countries.
Yeah.
Where's the revolution in European countries over COVID?
Well, with foreign help, we would see it.
Maybe, exactly. But it's what I mean. Well, that's it.
They're very carefully
It's not organic. The average person, grassroots, ordinary people who are complaining about something, who have a problem with some government policy or with government itself, have protests, have peaceful protests. They don't from one day to the next. They're not able to, from one day to the next, turn that peaceful grassroots protests into what appears to be a coup, where you get close to, or you potentially threaten the existence of the government, basically.
Yeah. Okay, folks, we need to take these police stations,
right,
the main state broadcaster, the military barracks,
right,
and the airport.
Right.
They wrecked the airport,
right,
the civilian, terminals at
right,
the airports. And there were early reports, I think it's fake news in the end, that they were actually trying to take over control of the airfield, control power and airplanes.
Mm-hmm.
But
there was a big exodus of private jets out of that airport as well in Almaty over those few days, of people flying to Russia and to Europe and stuff, because they were seriously concerned about what was going on. That kind of a fear and a kind of exodus of the elite doesn't happen in the face of grassroots protests about the price of gas.
Yeah,
it doesn't happen.
Yeah,
and this kind of organisation doesn't happen without outside help.
Yeah. I don't think anyone really disagrees with that.
Well, CNN definitely disagrees with it.
Oh, really?
Yes.
On the whole, though, I've seen a BBC report saying that at the root of this is probably a spat for control of government, i.e., it's a coup of sorts. Now they're just not mentioning the foreign element of it, but they're at least trying to come up with a plausible reason for the suddenness and the strong impact it had, within a space of days.
Yeah, yeah.
It's clear, like,
that it's
any reasonable
funded and organised, but the source of that is what's
an
question.
Attempt to topple the government, and as such, it's not just the people coming up and overthrowing. CNN.
No.
We'll see what it wants to see, but
yeah,
I haven't seen much kind of jumping on the bandwagon to paint this as a spontaneous.
No.
Organic revolution.
I mean, at the very least, they don't paint it in that way, but just report it in that way type thing, and leave out any sensible explanation of what's really happening. They give you this banal, bullshitty type explanation and just leave it at that. That's most of the reporting on But yeah, any other outlets that would go into a more normally go into a more in-depth analysis of it haven't been doing that to a large extent, because they'll have to give the whole idea of foreign intervention a wide berth, as they always do. So,
and Kazakhstan, another political issue that's ongoing, because for almost 3 decades, the president, again, it's a one-party state, but it's multiple clans, something like that, and he's
spread out around the country.
He's kind of the monarch, and he's trying to balance all the interests within the country.
Right.
That's Nazarbayev. He's like. He's in there longer than Putin. He's in there longer than Lukashenko.
Well, he's 81 years old. Like, he was the prime minister. He was the president. He's
formally done, but he's not. He's actually the head of the Security Council.
Right. But he willingly left that job, or resigned from that in the face of these protests as a kind of sop to at least some of the protesters. And
did he say he's left that? Okay.
Yeah, he's willingly, and what do you call him? The actual
Tokayev is the actual president.
The actual president kind of claimed that he had kind of removed him from that position, but it was with what's his name? Nazarbayev's with his compliance, basically.
Yeah.
So the two of them don't seem to be. They're not in opposition.
No.
It wasn't one kicking the other out, whatever. You know what I mean?
No.
It was, but it's this other guy. I've forgotten his name.
I have it here.
There's too many different names here.
Well, this other guy is some character, Karim Masimov. He was twice prime minister under Nazarbayev,
and then he was head of the Security Council himself.
I mean, they've known each other since the 90s.
Right.
Head of the Security Council
as well.
He was.
That was his most recent.
That was
his most recent.
Wasn't he head of intelligence?
Same thing.
Okay, same thing there.
But he,
this guy,
he's a guy who's been accused of treason.
Yes, he's
along
been arrested.
With others, arrested and accused of treason. He would have been the point man who would have been in a position to enable these kind of groups to be spread around the country and to act in the way they acted. You know what I mean? And he obviously, America has relatively a lot of American involvement in Kazakhstan. In terms of funding and NGOs and oil companies and stuff involved and all that kind of stuff.
Compared to Russia, Kazakhstan has made a point of being far more open to Western
which
interests.
Means there's all sorts of meetings back and forth and at a high level between government officials or intelligence officials, and over the years you can get in contact with this Masimov guy and flesh something out.
If you look him up and do a Google image search,
that's the other thing.
He shakes hands with everyone. He's been there with everyone in Washington,
right?
Going back to
just go to the
Bush administration.
Go to the New York Post there. This is from just last year.
Headline: Joe Biden was a quote regular at DC hotspot where he met Hunter's, the son, Kazakh associates.
Let's just scroll down there. So anyway, you'll see the name. Where is it? Karim Masimov, second paragraph towards the end. So there's just a report basically on Hunter and Joe Biden hooking up in Washington, D.C. with this guy Masimov, who was
introducing them to
former
oligarchs in Kazakhstan
to do deals to make a bunch of money, to loot the country, corruption, etc. So whenever American politicians and Joe Biden, for example, might talk, or his spokespeople might talk about corruption in Afghanistan or corruption in Kazakhstan, then Joe Biden and Hunter Biden are front and center in that corruption, obviously.
If you scroll down, actually, the photo in question shows this Masimov guy with the Bidens at this restaurant in New York where they frequently met. This is the photo. On the right is the Masimov character. And on the left is the oligarch, son of some other oligarch, who was telling the Bidens. This all came out, by the way, on the Hunter Biden laptop. Do you remember that thing? No, you don't, because the media banned any information about it, but it still leaked out. Subsequently, the guy on the left had $300 million to spare, and he wanted to invest in the United States. So Hunter got the big guy in on a deal to help the Kazakh oligarch launder money in the United States, thanks to former Prime Minister and recently arrested for treason guy on the right. The other detail that emerged from this report last year is that Masimov helped Hunter Biden create a company registered in Kazakhstan called Burisma Kazakhstan.
Right, he likes that
He
name.
couldn't even come up with a new name. He just said, well, we've opened a franchise in Ukraine. Let's do one in Kazakhstan.
Yep. There's going to be a global empire.
So now this isn't to place the Bidens at the center of the conspiracy, but it just means that they follow...
shows how involved they are.
They follow the money, they follow the empire, they follow the intrigue. If it's to be had, let's get it.
Well, what it shows is access to high-level members of the, Joe Biden, the current sitting president, his son, and obviously you can expand that out to many other people. Their direct, very friendly business deals and personal contacts with this guy Masimov, who was just accused of treason in Kazakhstan over the attempted coup, riots, whatever you want to call it, over the past week. So just, make sure people get that clear in their head. Joe Biden, best buddies, business deals, $300 million with a guy, former PM in Afghanistan, who was just accused of treason over the riots or the attempted coup in Kazakhstan over the attempted coup. So there you go. It put Joe Biden pretty much not at the center of it, but...
Well, it's what he was doing in his down years.
Right.
He had been vice president. No, that was subsequent. It was in
2018,
between. But it was still, pay for play. It's access to DC and lobbying.
But the contacts were first made when he was VP.
While he was VP.
Because that's the attraction, right? He's got access, right? He's VP under Obama. Just go to the Telegraph article. This is a response from the British government. They seize 600 million worth of assets belonging to the Kazakh government, calling for sanctions in the wake of a brutal crackdown. Again, no context, no understanding of the way what's usually behind these kind of protests.
Brutal crackdown is definitely not fair on the government. It's more likely it was a brutal attack on them. That's certainly what happened
overseas.
First. To the extent of a crackdown, we don't know. We know that this guy's been arrested. The reports have started to slow down about what's going on there. But at this point, the Kazakhstan government is back in charge of the airport, certainly of the state media.
Yeah, pretty much of all of it. It seems to have gone away very quickly, and it coincided with Russia's very quick response in terms of sending in, I think they sent in 2,500 troops to secure key areas. Now that's interesting in itself. Russia doesn't send troops onto the streets to deal with any kind of violence or protesters or shooting. They send Russian troops to 2,500 of them separated up into key areas in different parts of the country and in the major city in Almaty, and that makes everything calm down.
Yes.
What does that tell you?
Ostensibly, they said the strategic reason for that was to free up Kazakh resources to confront the gunfire and the clashes directly.
Maybe, but it's still only 2,500,
Yeah. But you're suggesting that there's a messaging factor alone, which is, look, if we need to, we'll do what we have to do. And that immediately makes the operators go, okay, back out. Everyone.
Yeah, we're not going to achieve our objectives, which is not just to have people in the street protesting about gas prices. It's to take over key infrastructure areas or infrastructure buildings, etc., and strategic resources in order to effect a generalized coup in the country. If you can't get that, then there's no point, which exposes the fact that was the point all along. But that was kind of nipped in the bud, and that's the end of the protest, basically. I mean, you still might have some protests, but it goes back to people in the streets.
Well, you're going to go back to protests.
A few dozen people in the streets protesting about the price of gas.
Yeah,
which is what, in theory, that's what it always was, except for this brief interlude of it almost being a violent, bloody coup d'etat.
Yeah, isn't it amazing how fast that swung into action?
Overnight, yeah.
I mean, to wrap their heads around it, people have tried to analyze and go, well, did they actually instigate the gas price rise, knowing that no, that's too much? I think it's more like that happened. there was
taking an opportunity.
There was a protest called for, particularly in the gas and oil producing regions in a city over in the far west of Kazakhstan, near the Caspian Sea.
Right.
And within 36, 48 hours, it's like the whole government's under siege.
Right.
You know, police are having their head cut off.
Yeah.
Which suggests that there's a hotbed of organization that's always there, and then someone just presses go when opportunity arises.
Because it's well planned in advance, and they're ready to go on the order, right? And they know what to do.
I mean, in 4 days, there's the thing that they've been talking about for a month now about Russian invasion of Ukraine, Russia, in their lexicon, invaded Kazakhstan, and it's calmed down.
Yeah. Exactly,
Although they did it in a step-by-step formal way where they were invited in, CTSO, which is, of course, what Russia would love to be, how they would love to be putting out the fire in Ukraine, except that's all teed up to prevent them from intervening at all because, quote, Russian invasion, sovereignty of nations and all that stuff. But what a switch. I mean, we were all looking at Ukraine and going, okay, what's going to happen here? And then, boom, Kazakhstan.
Yeah.
And that speaks a lot to Russian concerns about Ukraine. And remember, it's only 6 months. I mean, things move fast these days, but in the space of a year, 3 countries on Russia's border, 4 if you include Afghanistan, really, go back to last August. Go back to last July, there's it was the same month, wasn't it? That was interesting as well. It was the same month where Belarus had the mass protests over their election in early August. And it was 10 days later, the news was going fast. It was suddenly Afghanistan was an issue. And in between, Russia, with all the stands, held massive, quote, anti-terrorist drills in those countries, Kazakhstan, Uzbekistan, Turkmenistan. They weren't held in Russia. Russian troops came down and they did joint drills.
In the buffer zone.
In the buffer zone to simulate a war game where they were creating a line of defense against a horde, in quotes, coming from Afghanistan
in Toyota pickup trucks.
Yeah.
Probably.
So it's all connected.
Yeah. It's all connected, man. Mind blown. Mind blown, man. No, it's... but this...
But it's a no-duh for Russia. But whenever they're trying to communicate the seriousness as how they see it to anyone else, it's like, yeah, right. This is Russia... This is Russian scheming to get more stuff, to get more land, to get more of Ukraine, you know?
Yeah, for sure.
To absorb Belarus, to absorb any of its former USSR states.
Yeah.
But no, the actual sequence of events demonstrates, it's the clear evidence in their favor for why they're always concerned with things flaring up
on their borders.
On the borders.
Yeah. Because that's what America does. That's what America's done throughout the entire Cold War. Tried to do through the Cold War against the Soviet Union. And then it just segued straight into Cold War II, which was no difference. Basically, Russia was smaller, but those former Soviet republics that used to be part of the Soviet Union were, after the fall of the Soviet Union, and especially when Putin came along, they became Russia's buffer countries. They're not part of the Soviet Union, they're not owned by Russia, but they're allied with Russia. They should be allied with Russia from Russia's point of view. And America has just continued to try and attack and Russia's borders, basically, and to try and push back against Russia and put pressure on Russia, because Russia is a peer competitor in different ways and a threat to American hegemony in the world. And that's what America does to those kind of, to any country that can potentially challenge them or compete with them on an equal footing in different ways. Then America doesn't like that and sees you as a threat and will do whatever it can to harry you and harass you and try and ultimately they'd love to kind of overthrow your government and take control of you, but they'll do everything they can up to that point. So anyway, Russia is talking about Kazakhstan. They're having a meeting tomorrow on Monday with these other former republics on the what's the acronym?
Collective Security, CSTO
countries about the situation in Kazakhstan, to kind of like just to put it to bed basically. And then I think on Wednesday they are having talks with Russia's having talks with the US partners, as Putin likes to call them, on Ukraine, because that's still boiling away in the background. And if we just go to CNN, there, I know I don't like to go to CNN very often, but sometimes it's instructive to just see what the State Department wants you to think.
Biden officials weighing Russia sanctions options after warnings about economic fallout, heightened cyber risk for US and allies.
So if you go down, we'll read a little bit of this. CNN, it's awesome in its arrogance and hubris. So basically, Biden administration still weighing exactly how it would penalize Russia if the country invades Ukraine. So there's this supposed still threat from Russia that it'll invade Ukraine. Of course, the reason Russia might invade Ukraine, if you just throw back up that the map there, Scotty, for a second, invasion of Ukraine would be in the area marked Donbass there, which is separatist, pseudo, partly kind of semi-independent republic that broke away in 2014 after the US staged a coup in Ukraine in an attempt to take over Crimea, which is in green there at the bottom of Ukraine, which used to be part of Ukraine, but in response to the US staging basically a coup, if everybody remembers 2014, Euromaidan, all the violence and the fleeing of Yanukovych, the former prime minister, who was pretty much, centrist, moderate, not really aligned fully to Russia, but certainly not aligned with the West either. He was trying to play a balancing act. The Americans didn't like that because they wanted to take Ukraine for them. They want a fully compliant Ukraine so that they can then do all sorts of things in Ukraine, obviously control it. Well, we know about Biden and Hunter Biden looting Ukraine and engaged in massive corruption in Ukraine. That's one part of it, obviously, and other people are involved in that as well in the US. But geopolitically, Ukraine is important for the US so that it can push right up to Russia's borders, and it can make Ukraine a kind of NATO country where they can install US missiles pointed at Russia without actually saying that Ukraine is part of NATO, let's say. So in response to that coup that facilitated that takeover of Ukraine by the US, Russia decided, okay, well, obviously one of your main reasons for doing this is to deny us access to Crimea, which gives us access through Constantinople to the Mediterranean, because Russia has its Black Sea fleet in Ukraine there in Sevastopol. America wanted to deny that to Russia, so that's why they did the coup, and the plan was, well, you're not allowed to use the base in Ukraine anymore because now America owns Ukraine. So Russia, and also obviously to push right up against Russia's borders. So the best Russia could do in that situation was to very quickly, if you remember, take Ukraine, have a referendum. The referendum was overwhelmingly in support of Ukraine joining Russia. So then it turned green, as you can see. And the purple Donbass area and below it Luhansk, that's Donetsk and Luhansk. Those two areas very much vast majority populated by ethnic Russians who see themselves as Russian, who speak Russian. They decided to declare independence, and with the help of Russia, militarily, they were able to defend themselves from the pretty shitty, at the time it has to be said, the pretty shitty and ragtag Ukrainian army that couldn't do very much to actually do anything about them doing that. So, but in the meantime, in the last 7 years, what's been happening is that America has been arming and training and upgrading the Ukrainian army to the point that over the past couple of months there's been a building crisis because the Ukrainians have been emboldened because they've got American weaponry and they're threatening basically to try and maybe invade that Donbass and below it the Luhansk area. And this is what the whole talk about Russia possibly invading Ukraine, right? It's because Ukraine is invading Ukraine in a way. Ukraine is threatening under the guidance of America, the Ukrainian military and the Ukrainian government has been threatening to inflict a lot of suffering and death on the people in that Donbass and particularly Donbass or Donetsk region area, and putting Russia in a bind in the sense of they feel the need to defend those people and not let them be slaughtered, and also to not give up something they carved out in 2014 after the US coup in Ukraine. They carved out those two areas as a kind of interim buffer zone, basically to contain a little bit of that buffer between Russia's border and Ukraine, which was now a US protectorate, basically. And
I guess they imagined to have a say in how things would develop in Ukraine as a whole.
As well.
Influence. But that hasn't changed.
No.
Instead, the weapons just keep coming in.
Right, for sure. So it's not so much that Russia's, despite what the Western media is saying and Western governments are saying, that Russia's might invade Ukraine. The only reason Russia would invade Ukraine, and they wouldn't invade Ukraine, that invade or in some way facilitate the people in that Donbass region to defend themselves against Ukrainian/US aggression against them, where they would be attempting to take that purple area back from Russia, effectively, and prevent it from being Russia aligned, essentially. So it's not as simple as as it's been explained to you. Obviously, it's closer to the opposite than what the Western media says.
Yeah.
It's the West is really attempting to, in a certain sense, invade Russia, and Russia is concerned about what it might be provoked to do by the US crossing this line or pushing it or antagonizing it to this extent. So that's basically what's going on. So if we go back to the CNN article, this is what they're talking about when they say it's still weighing exactly how it would penalize Russia if the country invades Ukraine. Some Biden administration officials are warning of collateral economic damage from harsh sanctions and the risk of retaliatory Russian cyber attacks, blah, blah, blah. Should the US follow through with Biden's promised severe consequences on the Russian economy if Putin orders a full-scale invasion of Ukraine? Now, of course, I don't think Putin's ever going to order a full-scale invasion of Ukraine, but they're talking it up like that in order to justify this severe sanctions.
Well, what are these? Because these are different. This is not the same as what we've seen over the last 7 years.
The main thing would be the mothball Nord Stream 2.
You think the main thing?
That and,
I've heard that they intend to basically block Russia's use of the international financial system.
Right, of SWIFT, access to SWIFT. And also they would penalise them in terms of being able to do international, financial transactions, all that kind of stuff. They would sanction, the sanctions would, they would be expanded and extended. Financial sanctions against Russian companies, Russian individuals, trade, Russian international financial trade, basically, because America has a lot of leverage over that, along with its partners, but also Nord Stream 2. All of it together would be very bad.
Yeah.
Of course, if we read on, they say 2 analyses were done in recent weeks by the Treasury and State Departments found that sanctions that would be most crippling to Russia could also damage economies throughout the rest of the world by potentially spiking gas prices or hampering European trade and investment with Russia at a particularly delicate moment for the bloc, i.e. for the EU. So this would be, if America was to impose sanctions on Russia, the Americans know that it could be disastrous for Europe. But you know what? Tough shit.
Freedom calls.
So we're going to severely damage the European economy because we can by imposing sanctions on Russia. Just that statement alone should clue people in to just how the world works and how, but one concern is that those negative effects could boomerang back onto the US during an election year. Ooh. Sources told CNN. But others in the administration believe the tough sanctions being weighed would have a manageable impact on the US and would be worth it to impose severe penalties on Russia. So it would be worth it because America they think, wouldn't be so badly affected. Europe would be screwed, but it would be worth it for America to push back against Russia.
Yeah.
The extent of the blowback would depend largely on the parameters of the sanctions and how much Europe would suffer, said Jeff Schultz. Can you scroll down there, Scotty? Okay, stop. The problem with discussing these countermeasures is that if you take a strong sanctions action, that has a big impact on the European economy that will in turn rebound onto the US economy. So here's the details. The administration has been considering options including targeting major Russian commercial banks, sanctioning Russia's energy sector, blocking Russia's access to bond markets, cutting Russia off from the SWIFT international payment system, and tightening export control measures. And then one of the most realistic economic penalties that the US and its allies could impose would be to kill the Russia to Germany gas pipeline project, Nord Stream 2, which, blah, 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 accounts for 10 to 15% of European Union gas consumption, but will bypass Ukraine and be a major boon to Russia. So they've been lobbying Germany to commit to killing the pipeline in Russian invades, which the Germans have more or less signed up to. Scroll down a little bit. Whatever we decide in concert with our allies and partners is the right course for our collective interests and security. We are prepared to deliver severe costs to the Russian economy while minimizing unwanted spillover. They're talking about themselves, obviously. This is the elite talking about themselves, because obviously whatever we decide in concert with our allies and partners, that's, European governments, is the right course for our collective interests and security. But they're just talking about themselves there, because obviously there's a very serious risk that there would be a massive spike. There would be a massive spike in energy prices, in gas, oil, all of it would go through the roof, and that then would have a spillover, obviously, and that would directly impact the cost of living for hundreds of millions of Europeans. And it would also very possibly spill over into other areas of the economy. It could be a global economic crisis unlike anything anybody's ever seen before, and it all is to serve their mad ideological agenda of pushing it back against Russia, because Russia is a peer competitor, basically, and they don't want it to ever be in a position to act like a peer competitor, even though it already is. Yeah.
And you would think that people in Europe would be going, elites in Europe who love the Western Empire as it is would be going, oh, that might be taking it too far. Mm-hmm. But I have a tweet yesterday from Guy Verhofstadt, ex-Prime Minister of Belgium, ex-head of the European Commission, or he's an EU guy. He's Mr. United States of Europe. His vision is the European Union being fully politicized into one entity. He just tweets a Washington Post article which outlines the same things they have lined up for Russia. Basically complete throttling of the economy, which they admit would have knock-on effects, even on the United States itself.
Mm-hmm. You got that?
We'll put it up.
Put them on. Just tweet.
He either doesn't understand, or he does and he doesn't care of what this implies. 10 years ago, others in Europe did understand. They were trying to rein in American, sanctions on Russia. This is having knock-on effects on our agriculture and so on. But no, this kind of full state of financial siege on Russia is welcomed by this European Union head honcho when he says Putin's brutality is hard to counter, but the West holds an all-important key: money. We must use it.
One can only hope that there are still enough leaders in the free world today who are willing to put principle over bacon.
That's quoting the Washington Post editorial, which is obviously trying to frame all of this in the context of Putin is the one who's amoral. We are moral in our use of money and mammon to throttle Russia completely, knowing that it will have adverse consequences for our own fellow citizens.
Yeah. Where's any evidence to back up that statement at the very beginning? Putin's brutality is hard to counter, but the West holds. Well, Putin's brutality is hard to counter. What evidence is there to back up that statement, Putin's brutality, that Putin is brutal? What are they talking about?
Oh, well, they cite everything. They cite everything from he poisons his opponents.
Right,
he gets them whacked.
They've got a long list going back.
Yeah, they have a long set of evidence, proofs, facts on the ground, which, if you take the time to look at each one individually, are manipulated. They were done, and then the flag was put on Russia. Obviously, there's MH17 in 2014, the assassination of Litvinenko in 2006.
Right.
That's
they set it
up for them.
Well
there's no he believes that. There's no ideological discrepancy there when Mr. Europe says Putin's brutality is hard to counter. He's a fool.
He believes it because it serves his interests. Because he's an Atlanticist and he doesn't want any kind of integration between Europe and Russia and further afield over into Eurasia. He doesn't want any kind of Eurasian integration. He's an Atlanticist. He's looking to America all the time. He sees that that's where his future lies, and any possible threat, and there is a threat, and this is part of the whole problem, that for a long time, even back during the Cold War, a big fear of the Americans and their NATO allies, at least some of them, particularly the Brits and the Americans, was that Europe, Western Europe, would fall to the Soviet Union. And we talked about that before in terms of all the methods that they went into to try and prevent that from happening. But that continued on. There's no break at all between that policy based on that fear of Western Europe, quote unquote, falling to Russia. There's no break between the first Cold War and the second Cold War, which we're in now. They just continued on without breaking a step.
Yep.
Russia didn't change in terms of its threat. It has always been a threat from after the Second World War, or before the Second World War, maybe, but certainly from the time of the Second World War, Russia has been the primary ideological, political, geopolitical, economic, military threat to the West, and has been seen that way forever.
Because all things being equal, its integration into, quote unquote, the West, what would come with it would be a parity in voting power, in its influence into determining what does and does not get done, particularly with its own resources. The West is all for integration, so long as
it's
London, Brussels, Dublin, Washington and Paris have the dominating, deciding, the voting power remains with us. It doesn't matter whether you represent the world island and 80% of the world's population. We will retain control over it.
Over what happens,
Yeah.
You're all subservient to us, basically.
Yeah. And that's Putin's brutality in his mind. It's like this bulwark to that happening. If we just got rid of him, now it's not that simple, of course. They understand it's him and anyone who would maintain the tradition that he's upholding. If we can just denature that, ideally wipe it away overnight in a palace coup, but whatever, in some way get it under heel, then Russia will get all the money it wants, all the investment, the foreign direct investment. I can have access to all the bond markets it wants. It can choke itself, sending us as much gas and oil as it wants. No problem. It can wreck its environment in the process.
As long as
we've no problem.
Doesn't stand for a
there's no Putin or anyone like him.
As long as it doesn't stand for a multipolar world. As long as it agrees to take its place down the totem pole in a world that is headed by America and the Anglo-America.
The glee with which he was beautiful. I love the way he got it all in less than 10 words. We hold an all-important key, money. We must use it. And it speaks to it speaks to a lot of history, really. The control of money, the control of the banking system, this elite club. You can have membership at the table, but under our conditions, you know. And their willingness to, even though they understand the complexity of the world and the integration of all things, their willingness to take a massive hit. Well, not exactly. For their own electorates to take a massive hit.
For the people to be screwed.
Yeah. Of which we've already seen, you know, just before this winter and late fall, you know, gas prices spiked, and that caused immediate economic consequences on everything. It's not just heating of homes, to which the German government responded by saying, they didn't respond by going, well, how do we ensure energy security this winter? They responded by doing a massive PR campaign and telling its population to brace for impact. It's going to be cold. We're going to have shortages. We're going to have rolling blackouts. If France, yesterday, we saw that headline on RT, told its population to expect a 40% increase in the price of, in how much they'll pay in energy bills this winter.
Yeah, we'll just have that, throw that up there. It's the last RT article, Scotty. This is the French government announcing that basically February. So there's a time frame that they all have in mind here, you know, and there's talks going on and you know, supposedly to solve the Ukrainian crisis, to find a diplomatic solution, but the US doesn't seem to be inclined in that direction. They feel that they've got the upper hand on Russia and that they can squeeze them and nail them to the wall, and Russia's not willing to do that, and that's what we talked previously in previous shows about over the past few months, Putin showing a kind of uncharacteristic alarm over what was actually happening, what the messaging he was getting out of Washington. This something had changed, that these people had lost their marbles basically, and they were going beyond anything they had ever gone.
They seem so certain.
Yeah,
I think like Guy Verhofstadt, we just saw there was a gloating.
Yeah, that they feel that they've got them over a barrel basically. And this is, I mean, there seems to be a time frame, and this is why we're watching. We're just giving a heads up to people here that you know, the French government basically has said may see 40% electricity price surge by February. That's in the space of what? Okay, so like end of February, it's 6 or 7 weeks, but it could be a month, in a month's time. So what are they hearing? What's the French government hearing about what is possibly in the offing on the political stage that is going to cause this to happen for them to make this announcement? 40% in 1 month?
Yeah. And the man who said it was the country's finance minister, Bruno Le Maire. He's being clever. He's putting it in the context of what just happened in Kazakhstan. He says, look what's going on in Kazakhstan. It's quite indicative of what can happen when energy prices explode. It's politically dangerous.
Look what can happen when politics, when ideologically possessed politicians lose their marbles, basically, and poke the Russian bear to the point and effectively engage in massively reckless and almost like self-destructive policies to serve their ideological agenda that makes hundreds of millions of people suffer. That's what he actually means by that statement. Look what happened in Kazakhstan, because if you put Kazakhstan in the context of it actually being organized from without, probably by elements of Western intelligence services, then you can see the whole point. The point is that we're going after Russia here, and there's going to be consequences. We're going to impose these ridiculous sanctions that may well collapse the entire global economy eventually, but it's worth it.
And then I should point out that in Britain, media reports there in December, so before Kazakhstan, told people to expect an average increase of something like 50% in their utility bills over this winter. 50%, that's higher than that, and it predates Kazakhstan.
Right, because they knew it was coming. And we've talked about this in previous shows going back to last September about they had the whole supply chain crisis, and obviously it was blamed on COVID, but then you went into an energy crisis, gas prices in Europe, and that was blamed on going through the roof, up and down to record highs, and that was blamed on Russia. Supposedly Russia's withholding its gas supplies as a geopolitical tool, and that's what they're speaking there to their fear that I spoke about previously, which is that Russia would get some kind of a strong political influence or control over Europe through its energy supply to Europe, and that's what Nord Stream 2 is, right? It's a new gas pipeline already completed, waiting to be put online, but it's put on hold to see if Russia will, if we can use the activation of Nord Stream 2 as leverage to get Russia to do what? To stop being Russia, to Putin stop being Putin. So if you just go to that CNN article I just sent you, Scotty, it's kind of again, it's indicative. CNN is useful to get the kind of from the horse's mouth what's happening in the State Department, because they basically just repeat State Department lackeys and American exceptionalist ideologues, anti-Russian ideologues, what they say, and obviously that's a very good definition of the Biden administration, which is basically the deep state administration. It's the Washington establishment administration. Biden's obviously a puppet for them. But if you just scroll down, next week may see one of the most significant and defining moments in relations between the North NATO and Russia since the breakup of the Soviet Union. What an opener. So 30-member state NATO and the Russian Federation will meet in Brussels on Wednesday to discuss the recent build-up of Russian troops on the border between Russia and Ukraine. That's not really what they're discussing, but obviously that's what CNN said. And US and Russian diplomats will meet in Geneva tomorrow, actually, to discuss the same crisis. So Blinken, US Secretary of State, said there are two paths. One of them being the option of diplomacy and de-escalation. The other one, who knows? So scroll down. The recent escalation in tension has sparked fears of a repeat of 2014. Get this, here's CNN and the State Department's explanation of what happened in 2014, when Russia forcibly annexed the Black Sea Peninsula of Crimea and backed separatists in eastern Ukraine. This act, the fact that Russia was able to do it and get away with it, triggered years of serious conversations in policy circles about the role of the West and whether or not it was capable of standing up to Russia. And of course, there's no mention there of the fact that Russia annexed Crimea and aided the separatists in eastern Ukraine, because the country was subjected to a massive violent coup by the CIA, effectively, by the State Department. No mention of that in CNN reporting at all. None of that would have happened. None of what Russia did would have happened if they hadn't organized a violent coup in Ukraine, which is right on Russia's border, and a country that Russia has long made it very clear that that country has to remain independent at the very least, because it's right on our border, and we're not having NATO. As you agreed after the fall of the Soviet Union, you agreed with Russian diplomats in bilateral talks. You agreed that Russia...
but nothing was ever put on paper.
It was put on paper.
Well, that's what they keep saying. I saw another article today about that. Russia's lie, big lie.
Yeah.
Nothing was ever put on paper. We never said that.
Well, I think I actually have something here to that effect, but I'll show you in a minute. So Russia, on relations between the West and Russia, never rebounded after that point, reaching Cold War level lows, whatever. Blinken said Friday that progress could be made during the next week's diplomatic talks between the US, European and Russian officials, but that it had to be a two-way street, with Russia de-escalating the aggression towards Ukraine. So it was only last month that Moscow published 2 draft agreements outlining its demands for diffusing tensions on the Ukrainian border. Those demands include rolling back NATO deployments in Eastern Europe to some point in the 1990s, meaning many countries that neighbour Russia and were under the control of the Soviet Union would be less protected by the alliance. Of course, protected, but from what? Protected from doing business with Russia, basically. Keep going. Don't need to look at the picture. This, along with the promise of NATO not expanding further east, is an unacceptable demand and a non-starter from NATO's perspective. They say that Russia's demands could be deliberately ridiculous to force a rollback on things like admitting new NATO members, pulling the likes of Ukraine and Finland from the mix, or could simply be a performance that allows Russian officials to say that they tried to negotiate in order to justify an escalation to their citizens. You know, they're kind of setting up in advance here that what Russia wants, we're not going to give, and Russia's just going to do what it's going to do anyway, you know, which is kind of the opposite, really, because that's the tack that the Americans are taking. So again, serious economic consequences. We will use tools that weren't deployed in 2014. It's fair to say that these sanctions would be a mixture of hard economic sanctions and even more NATO on Russia's doorstep. Risky as Western hostility might be in provoking Putin, inaction could be worse. Capitulating to the out of this world demands would make the overall situation much more dangerous, as it would just embolden the Kremlin to act aggressively, says some dude. Moreover, China and other revisionists are watching the reaction. What is notable when talking to officials and experts is a sense that the West is far less scared of Russia than it has been in recent years. Poisonings and assassination of Russian citizens on foreign soil, brutal suppression and imprisonment of political opponents, interference in foreign elections, and the annexation of Crimea have all painted an image of Putin as a strong leader who must be feared. And there's leader of the free world there. Yay. In this image, naturally, if you live in Russia or a neighbouring nation and have opposed Putin, then he's a scary individual. But Putin is an aging autocrat, obsessed with the legacy of his rule and that of the failure of the Soviet Union. Russia has been ravaged by COVID-19, and the future of its hydrocarbon export economy looks bleak. I.e., Russia is on the ropes. We can go for it here, is what they're saying, basically, right? Really see who they're quoting here. His country has an economy roughly the same size as New York. If the West properly coordinated economic sanctions against him and against Russian business without fear, he would be backed into a corner very quickly, says Bill Browder. Do we need to say who Bill Browder is? Magnitsky Act. Bill Browder is a quisling. Yeah. Look him up. So that's partly why next week is so important. If NATO allies do all get on the same page, it could send the strongest possible message at a critical moment. Just as Putin tries to push his luck again, the West has the opportunity to stay in a formal diplomatic setting that it's run out of patience. To say in a formal diplomatic setting that we're out of patience with you, Putin. Yeah, we're drawing a line.
Of course, the gamble is really, it's the West that's making the gamble.
Yeah. So,
and the gamble is Russia will not do anything in response to anything we do, because that risks nuclear war, right?
Right, which
That's
is true.
the bet.
Which is true.
Which is true. So, okay, how does this play out then? Realistically, next week, neither side backs down, and the US goes into its new sanctions regime against Russia.
And very quickly.
What you seem to be suggesting before Kazakhstan last week when we discussed this, you said that that's basically curtains for the global economy, as it is, with the US being the main arbiter, the US dollar being the anchor for
they have a grand plan to stage manage an economic crisis where they think that it serves geopolitical their geopolitical agenda of, you know, kind of neutering Russia, let's say, really cutting Russia off, souring relations between Russia and Europe forever type thing, or for the foreseeable future, hurting Russia economically while everybody else, well, America stays fairly immune to it. They manage it. It's really only Russia. It's really only Europe that'll suffer a little bit, but even that's kind of manageable. Sure, European gas prices and oil prices would spike and stuff, and European consumers would be hit. But, you know, it'll last for a while, but we'll get over it. But it's worth it. You know, it's a short-term pain for long-term geopolitical gain for the Washington ideologues, and they're willing to let Europeans suffer, and maybe Americans to some extent suffer, for this greater goal of protecting the realm, which is all about themselves, obviously got nothing to do with people. But I think they're deluded, and if they try to stage manage a kind of an economic, first and foremost, an energy crisis that then would spiral a bit into other areas of the global economy, if they think they can manage that, they're deluded. And that would spiral out of control, and it would get beyond them, and you would have a massive economic downturn.
Food riots in Europe.
You'd have, food supply chain, you know.
Governments falling.
I mean, there's a wild card there of some kind of environmental or climactic event interceding at just the wrong time type thing, which might push it over the edge and turn it into a real economic downturn, you know what I mean, where America thinks that it's safe or something like that, because, you know, it's basically, it's doing all the sanctioning, it's got control of the economic strings, America isn't going to get hurt. All the people are hurt a little bit, all the people in the world, Russia, obviously, Europe, maybe all the places in the world, but not America. And America obviously, you know, will control everything ultimately and put things back, you know, put them back the way they were after a certain period of time, when the lesson has been learned, let's say, by Russia, or they've been punished enough, then they can turn things back on. They can say, okay, now you can turn on Nord Stream to save Europe from its
cold winter
energy,
or whatever,
or energy crisis, whatever. But who knows? I mean, I have a kind of that's crystal ball. Then a further crystal ball, more abstract crystal ball down the line would be at some point during that process, you might have some kind of an earthquake or something in California, causing because, you know, especially in California, because I think most of US imports come through West Coast ports. So if you had any kind of a widespread destruction or problem as a result of an earthquake in California, you've, at a time when they've already destabilized the global economy, albeit in a kind of managed way, if you had something real intercede at that point, then yeah, you're in trouble, big trouble. Everybody's in trouble.
Yeah. You remember years ago, in the kind of in-between, it's in-between phase. It's how they see it as well themselves. You go from 2014 to now, and they spent all this time wondering, how are we going to get back at Russia for what they did to us? Mm-hmm. Crimea was like, it just said, it was, as somebody put it at the time, it was the first defeat for the empire in 500 years. Everything more or less had gone its way in all outcomes. I mean, for the ultimate money controlled, the arbiters of all this.
They were outraged that Russia would have the power and ability and audacity to do that, you know.
It led to it led to a flourishing of awakening, I suppose, among dissenters in the West, but also it emboldened people in capitals from New Delhi to Beijing to Moscow to talk openly about a new world system, a multipolar world.
It really put Russia on the map for serious-minded people and people who see the world perspicaciously, who understand how the world actually works. They realize that, okay, America isn't the only ruler anymore.
Yeah.
There's a power that can push back against America, and that radically changes the entire
Everyone wanted to buy
scene.
Russian
weapons, all that kind of stuff.
And especially air defense.
What followed that was really cemented afterwards when they, pretty much a year later, they started intervening in Syria.
Yeah, but that was a follow-up, because it gave another example for how things can be done. Oh, you have a terrorist problem? Well, watch how you manage it.
And I think that's what set the West on the course that they're on now.
Right.
In 2014, when they saw Russia do that, their plan at that point was to, like I said, to neutralize Russia. It was part of their plan to take Ukraine, to take away Crimea, take away Russia's military base in Sevastopol, their naval base in Sevastopol, and really, put Russia back in its place way down the pecking order. Russia said, no, we have a different trajectory. And at that point, the ideologues in Washington said, okay, that's it. We have to basically wreck this place. We have to wreck the economy.
That's what I was going to say. I remember when we came to that point and we articulated like that, we imagined them in Washington and other capitals going, what are we going to do? And that it appeared from their words and their actions that the grand plan was to go, okay, they think they've won this chess match. So what we'll do is we will wreck the chessboard. And is that now what we're seeing?
Well, 2014 was their attempt. Yeah, it is. 2014, their coup in Ukraine, their attempt to neuter Russia through taking Ukraine. That was one step in the process for them securing the realm, like I said before, and to carrying on and dominating the world. Once Russia would fall in that respect, then China would be easy to deal with because they wouldn't have Russia as an ally, and the march of the new American century would continue on a bit of complete global dominance. And now they were doing that at that point because they realized that if they didn't do that at that point, then the opposite was going to happen. The opposite was going to happen. They were going to lose out. They had to take radical action. And when that failed, then they decided on a new plan, essentially. We're not going to get to dominate the world anymore, so we're going to put a process or start a process to ultimately radically remake the Great Reset, you could call it.
And part of that is, I presume they have some modicum of actual intelligence left, at least in terms of self-preservation. So maybe part of the preparation for why there's been 7 years between that crisis and this one is because they have thought out at least and put into practice some fire control measures for when they do launch Operation Take It All Down, the economic global Samson option or whatever it is, that they would be relatively well insulated from the consequences.
So it's managed.
So that's the wishful thinking there. They think that they're going to actually
be able to manage.
They're going to reset everything to 1945, where they're still top dog and everyone else is floored. And what does the world need? The world needs a massive global Marshall Plan, and we're in a position to save the world from this terrible catastrophe.
A technocratic Marshall Plan, a technology-based Marshall Plan, which obviously involves. This isn't just about geopolitics. Obviously, this is about populations as well, and remaking or retooling the populations in terms of how they act, live, and that's what COVID was all about. The very strange disconnect between, I suppose, just normal health crisis that was only temporary, and people just needed to protect some people or whatever. That vision of it compared to what they actually did, which is to start instituting passes, electronic passes for people to get in and out of places, to get in and out of restaurants, to force people to get vaccinated, to try and divide society along, kind of create an apartheid society on health grounds. That's all got nothing to do with so-called respiratory virus that's is in a so-called pandemic that is obviously only short-lived and should only just be about health, about what's the best thing people can do, how can we protect people from, help them protect themselves, give them some advice. That's what it should have been, but it obviously was massively more than that. So all that other stuff is to do with managing of the population, preparing or conditioning of the population towards a reset of the economy and a reboot of the economy and a emergence of the global economy along more digital, cashless, technocratic technology.
More resource
lines.
scarce.
Yeah.
Lines, yeah, we're basically rationing.
Right.
And how to manage the rationing with so many people, well, you need the help of digital technology for it. That crossed my mind earlier this week that from March 2020, the obsession with having restaurants closed.
Yeah.
It might be simply to do with basic food allocation, where that was, okay, let's just write that all off because that's excess. We're going to need those reserves for what's coming next.
Right. Yeah. Just throw up that I saw it on Pepe Escobar on the Twitter. On that point you said about there was no assurances given after the collapse of the Soviet Union that NATO would not expand westwards. This is from the National Security Archive at George Washington University. These are documents that were declassified. U.S. Secretary of State James Baker's famous not 1 inch eastward assurance about NATO expansion in his meeting with Gorbachev in 1990 was part of a cascade of assurances about Soviet security given by Western leaders to Gorbachev and other Soviet officials throughout the process of German unification in 1990, according to declassified US, Soviet, German, British and French documents posted today by the National Security Archive at George Washington University. A cascade of assurances, verbal, written. The documents show that multiple national leaders were considering and rejecting Central and Eastern European membership in NATO as early as 1990, and that discussions of NATO in the context of German unification negotiations were not at all narrowly limited to the status of East German territory, and that subsequent Soviet and Russian complaints about being misled about NATO expansion were founded in written contemporaneous memcons and telcons at the highest levels. The documents reinforced former CIA Director Robert Gates' criticism of pressing ahead with expansion of NATO eastward in the 90s when Gorbachev and others were led to believe that wouldn't happen. So, is it written down? Is it official stamped document? Whatever, does it matter when the Russians
at the very least a gentleman's agreement, which at that level
repeatedly over and over again assurances were given, complaints were forthcoming and assurances were given that this would not happen, this would not happen. To do the opposite then is to go back on those assurances, and to say they were never given is a lie. So Russia has every reason to complain about expansion of NATO westwards, given that at the time, at the setup of this new order after the collapse of the Soviet Union, it was agreed by Western politicians that there wouldn't be any expansion of NATO eastwards in any way that would seriously bother Russia, which is obviously now they're more or less on Russia's border in Ukraine. And that's why Russia's pissed off. And that's why the narrative is that Russia is threatening to invade Ukraine. And that's why we have to sanction Russia, because it's going to invade Ukraine. Because, that graphic you see people from a few years ago, a picture of the globe, whatever, and all the US military bases. Yeah. And the caption is, look at how close all these countries are putting their borders to NATO military bases.
Yeah. Yeah.
Or to US military bases, we're not moving closer to your border. Your border somehow moved closer to our military base.
Yeah. Yeah, you're guilty of expansionism.
Yeah. Your border wasn't there before.
We're going to sanction you. You've come far too close to our bases.
Yeah.
It's amazing, isn't it?
It's crazy. So I think that's
such liars.
I think that's where it's going, and I think it'll happen pretty quickly. I mean, obviously, I can give no 100% assurances, whatever, but I think this week we'll see a lot out of how things go with this meeting tomorrow. in Geneva, and then more directly on Wednesday over Ukraine between Russia and the US, and how the Russians respond to that, and what the narrative is, and you get a clear feel for it from how it's going from the reports on it. And
the way they set it up, it sounds like they want to have Russia do something that justifies the sanctions they want to impose.
Yeah.
But maybe we will see a flare up, but it'll be a flashpoint. It'll be a relatively brief incident, because I doubt they will just go over the top anyway and say, okay, well, Russia did invade, but we're going to go ahead and throttle it anyway. They would want to go down as having been morally justified to a just war,
For sure, yeah.
So we should probably expect to see something happen
in Donetsk.
In or around, to do with Ukraine,
yeah, for sure. But what I mean in terms of as an outcome of the talks that they're having tomorrow and Wednesday, you'll get a feel from the reporting on those talks and from what the Russians say about them and stuff, of where the where the lay of the land is, basically, and how it looks going forward, and what's likely to happen soon after that. So they'll go through the process of having the talks, but my expectation is that there'll be no agreement. Russia won't be happy. They won't get any assurances. They'll be pissed off, and then it'll be stalemate, and then something will be provoked in Ukraine, trying to provoke Russia into doing something so they can shut down Nord Stream 2 and then institute their phony economic crisis, or their kind of managed economic crisis for Europe and Russia and maybe other parts of the world. But then it all goes sometime thereafter, spirals out of control.
And not necessarily because of any revenge. You notice that in their framing of this and reporting it to the CNN audience, they put in their headlines, comma, and also their fears of Russian cyber counterattacks. They're already setting it up such that when we do this, expect revenge from Russia, which will cause us problems at home.
Yeah. Which means we'll double down on our sanctions, and it'll be tit for tat, and it'll be a race to the bottom.
If that, I doubt even there would be such measures. I think they're preparing the ground for when there is blowback, so they can refer to, well, you see, they've got an ongoing high-level financial/digital cyber war going on with Russia. That's why, there's shortages of goods over here. Well, we're trying to keep the world at peace, but see those Russians over there,
Yeah, they keep screwing up they keep screwing up our websites.
They're trying to...
They hacked Amazon.
Well, they set it up all last year. There were dozens of hacks. Remember the one where the oil pipeline shut down from Texas through Louisiana all the way up to the Northeast?
Russia
and they're like, Russia did it. It was so flagrantly not Russia, and it was in fact a domestic test of some kind by US intelligence, that a week later Biden said, no, Russia didn't do it.
Yeah.
But they ran with the headline for it,
If in doubt, Russia did it, yeah. Yeah, it's been set up. But, it's a long process of setting up that scenario, you know what I mean? And that's why I'm coming at it from this perspective, is that I'm looking back over 10, 15 years here and seeing a pattern, a build-up, to a certain... And obviously, as more and more data comes in, it confirms to me where this is going. Obviously, my opinion on it. I'm not saying I knew where it was going 10 or 15 years ago, but
5 years ago, we knew they were going to wreck the chessboard.
Yeah, in some way. But as things progress, then we get more details. It fleshes out the details of what the likely scenario of what their plans are. And of course, in that process, their own plans have been coalescing and being refined down to more specific measures as that happens, We're just watching it as it moves along, you know what I mean?
To say my previous point in another way, the tragicomic part of it all is that they don't actually need Russia to engage this battle to bring about the scenario. There can be a provocation that makes it look like all of the actions, 100%, the sanctions, the blowback, which will be a result of market, going nuts, will all be their own doing. And then the things that they roll out to solve those problems will create, you know what I mean? It's 100%. They're fighting this phantom that isn't engaging in a battle back with them.
Well, they're fighting with themselves. They're fighting both sides of the war, right? They're the enemy and the and the defender, supposedly. You know, I mean, that's a very plausible scenario. Is that if Russia doesn't take the bait and doesn't do anything, they go ahead and impose some sanctions anyway, or have some kind of provocation that they justify some kind of sanctions against Russia on, because they really want to impose those sanctions, because those sanctions are important to start the ball rolling, so that they can justify some kind of an economic downturn that they hope will allow them to pass more sanctions against Russia. So, like in terms of cyber, the mention of cyber attacks, they could carry out a cyber attack themselves that would damage the economy somewhere in the world, like in America, in the West, in Europe, or somewhere, and blame it on Russia, and then use that as justification for more sanctions against Russia. If your goal is to have a stage managed crash of the economy, you're going to do it whatever way you want to, basically, and you will use Russia's hand. You know, you'll kind of pretend you'll put Russia's hand in the middle of it. You know, you'll put their fingerprints on it. It's very easy to do. You know what I mean? I mean, they supposedly put Russia's fingerprints on the hacking of the DNC. The hacking of the American election, supposedly in 2016, by calling some group Fancy Bear. You know, well, bear, right? Fancy.
Something like that, yeah.
They call it Fancy Bear. So Fancy Bear, and people were like, "Oh, you bear Russia, of course, yeah." So it's Fancy Bear. So the fancy Russian bear hacked our elections.
Yes, we Russians, we are clever. We hacked your elections and we left a signature.
Yeah.
So you would never find us.
Exactly.
What the fuck?
Exactly. Yeah. And of course, it was the NSA that did it. You know.
Yeah.
But that's how America rolls. You know.
Okay, so having framed it like that, what was the point of either piggybacking on or provoking this rioting in Kazakhstan last week?
Well, I mean, Kazakhstan was something that was very likely had been set up over several years, however many, like 5-6 years, whatever. You put the pieces in place, you make the contacts, you get agreements, you put infrastructure in place, and then it's waiting there at any moment for the button to be pressed. They decide they've got the resource that they've got this option that they put all these resources into, and now is a good time. I mean, Kazakhstan isn't that important.
But they spent it now.
So they spent it right in advance. Well, right in advance of, you know, I mean, maybe it didn't play out how they wanted it to. There's a lot of desperation in what these people are doing right now. So it didn't play out how they wanted to. Russia, eventually, other countries that you attack in this way get wise to your methods, and they know how to cut them off fairly quickly. And it seems that I think Russia, in the case of Kazakhstan, cut off. They stopped it prematurely from where it would have gone to, where the US would have liked to have gone to, which was a full-blown, longer-running coup, where Russia would have been sucked in for more, in terms of more, they would have had to involve themselves more because of more conflict, more turmoil, more like a Ukraine situation, you know what I mean? Although Russia didn't get directly involved in Ukraine, but it was a bait to Russia. And of course, Russia said, okay, I see your bait. I'm going to do what we need to do, which is send in a few thousand troops to secure the area. And, you know, we'll have ongoing, you know, we'll manage the situation with the Kazakh government and make sure it gets strangled in the crib, if you like. So it doesn't go anywhere. But the aim, obviously, would have been to create a crisis on right on Russia's border, that Russia was directly involved in, at a time when they were going ahead of at a time when and ongoing. If it had gone where they wanted to go, it would be ongoing at a time where they're having meetings about Ukraine, where they are accused of doing the same thing that they're accusing you of doing in Kazakhstan, of interfering in other elections, suppressing dissent, suppressing grassroots protests for democracy.
Global niggy sob.
Yeah, absolutely.
I've got you, son of a bitch.
Yeah.
They really do think they've got Russia.
Yeah. That's what's alarming Putin. Yeah. If I see someone who I've been a competitor with for a long time and we've jousted and stuff, but I had an understanding that we both understood, or that my opponent understood, that there was a line that shouldn't be crossed. You know, we can play our games. There's a lot of latitude for you to try and screw me over, and I try and push back against you from screwing me over, and I try and serve my interests, and you do as much. But there's an understanding that you don't go too far. You don't start punching me in the face. But when I see, or you don't start getting really violent. But when I see for years where we've just wrestled together, but I look over one day and I see you
preparing knives
or guns, I go, what's going on here? This is this is, I'm not going to play with, that's not playing anymore in a certain sense. We've called it playing all this time, although it's been serious and you've used all sorts of dirty tactics, but you have never gone to the point where you would actually try and kill me. But when you pull out a knife or a gun, when I see you starting to, go for your knives or guns, you're changing the nature of the game, and that's serious. You're bringing it up to a level of seriousness that is not good. It's not going to be good. I can warn you, it's not going to be good for anybody, because I also have a gun. Because obviously, if you pick up a gun, I'm going to pick up a gun, and I don't want to pick up a gun because both of us will probably be dead. But what's concerning me is that you don't seem to care or even know that you'll be dead too.
Right.
I'm seeing a kind of death wish in you. You know, I don't want to play with someone who has a death wish.
Yeah.
So,
a bunch of senators last couple of weeks tried to get it into law, but it's, remains on the books somewhere in the US, in the bowels of Congress, that should Putin run and win in 2024, they wouldn't recognize his legitimacy, which would have cascading effects in terms of, he would basically, they're basically saying you're no longer a protected man. That's the kind of implied threat. If you fly anywhere in the world and you're shot down, well, you're no longer afforded the same basic diplomatic
you become
courtesy
a
as
pariah.
everyone else.
Yeah, you're no longer
complete pariah. So it moves from all the headlines they've given with
right do they have
pariah to an actualization of it.
Yeah. Where there's an Interpol warrant out for your arrest, basically
kind
you
of
can't
thing.
leave your country and stuff. I mean, where do they get off doing that? Like, that's massive arrogance and hubris. Like, for one country in the world to think they have the right to determine who gets to be. Of course, I mean, when I say it now, who gets to be the ruler of any country. That's been America's thing for 80 years, and they're well versed and well trained in that, and they absolutely believe that they do have the right to do that, and they have acted on their belief and their right to do that multiple times. So yeah, it is a situation where you have someone who's lost their marbles. Basically, they've just lost the plot, and they don't realize that you can't do what you're not going to be able to do what you think you're able to do. I hope, because, or maybe you do know that you won't be able to do what you think you're able to do, what you're saying you're going to do, and you don't care. Is even worse. So Putin's in the process of trying to tell Americans, listen, what you think you're going to do, it's not going to work out that way, and you're going to suffer a lot. And he says that to them, and they say, meh. And then he looks at them and says, so you do know that you're not going to be able to do it, but that means that you don't care. So now I'm really alarmed. I think you've lost your marbles. I'm concerned. I mean, beforehand, you at least talked a bit of sense, and when you talked, you more or less acted in that way. Okay, you bent the rules a bit, but you more or less stuck to your guns. But I'm getting the impression now that you're not a rational actor anymore. You're not rational. You've got a crazy idea, and you don't seem to know that it's a crazy idea, or you do, and you don't care, which means you're crazier than I thought you were. So,
yeah,
that's the kind of impression I'm getting off from like we were talking about as alarm. That's my reading. I can imagine why he would be alarmed, because that's the impression I get from the Americans as well,
and the Europeans.
And the Europeans are a lot of them are part of it, a part of the whole Atlanticist movement and ideology, and they're on board. A lot of them who aren't part of it just are going along because they don't know what else to do. They don't have the power or influence to say anything about it, so they just carry on and they believe the propaganda. There are a few though that are just going like, dude.
Oh, well, we don't hear them anymore. The European Joseph Borrell, he's currently the European Union quote unquote foreign minister. On New Year's Eve, there's a report of him saying, in response to the Russians pleading for someone in NATO stand, anyone, to please respond to these proposals we have. It's basically a draft peace treaty he sent out to Brussels and Washington. And he laughed it off and told a reporter, only winners get to tell us what the red lines on anything are. Quote, we cannot compromise on fundamental principles.
Yeah.
If Moscow wants to talk about the security architecture in Europe, well, we do not want to. and must not be involved. Oh yeah, that's something else. He was bitching on the side about the fact that this was direct communication only at the time between the Kremlin and
you're bypassing Europe. How dare you?
Europe.
A bunch of Europeans getting all offended by the fact that Russia is talking to America and sidelining Europe, because the reason Russia's doing that is because it knows that Europe is basically a vassal state of America, and at least in these respects, there's no point in talking to European leaders about America, because they have no leverage over America. You have to talk to, it's the other way around. America has leverage over Europe. If you want to deal with Europe, well, you can deal with Europe to some extent. You can appeal to Macron, you can appeal to Merkel when she was around. You can try to appeal to them, but you always know that there's this big brother looming in the background, eavesdropping on every single conversation, every word, Yeah. So we didn't mention COVID at all. Is that good? Is that good? COVID's our only mention. My only comment on COVID, well, as it relates to what we've just been saying, is that it's kind of going away. Governments are still trying to exploit and use the capital they have built up over the past 2 years. The capital they built on the basis of fear, exaggerated hysterical fear among the population. They're still trying to use some of that reserve that's left over to try and talk up Omicron as if it's anything other than the cold. But there's a lot of stuff I'm seeing where people are just, scientists and stuff are saying, and even Boris Johnson yesterday said we're going to have to just live with it. We're not going to test. They shut down testing, basically, the mass testing. Shut that down. Let's just live with it as the cold. If that happens in Europe, even though the UK isn't part of Europe anymore, but anyway, the UK does that, other countries won't be far behind, especially as we move into warmer weather, into spring, summer. Can you imagine Omicron in the summer? Really, it's nothing. And there's too long a time between now. It's already running out at the height of the winter season, when everybody should be, like last year, everybody was encouraged and was willingly crapping their pants about it and locking themselves in their houses. Now they're not doing any more. Obviously, two jabs and a booster. I'm protected. It's the cold. What am I meant to be afraid of? If that's happening in January, early January, it's going to peter out as it gets into summer, and then you're not going to be able to resurrect it next September, October, right?
This is the point in the show where Joe goes, We've reached the nadir. It won't get any worse.
No, exactly. But that's why it relates to what we've been talking about for most of the show, which is that this, I think, because they know that the control that they've been afforded by the scariants and the pandemic, the so-called pandemic,
and the conditioning that came with it.
The conditioning is running out. It's a finite resource in that respect. It's not sustainable for forever. It's going away. The virus at the level of virology and stuff is turned into an endemic virus globally. It's not really a threat to anybody any more than the cold or the flu. So, sorry, that game's over. But let's segue straight into an economic disaster.
Yeah. And, of course, the leverage, the thing they'll carry over is, you mentioned the conditioning.
Right.
Which will be very useful.
Lockdowns.
Yeah.
Dependence on government. The last 2 years primarily has been about conditioning people to be more dependent on government.
Yeah, to be responsive.
That's all it's been about. To be responsive to
future crises when you were coming.
Absolutely. To condition, Pavlovian, to condition people to look to government as their saviors, to hang on their every word, And that's very important for government. A government, that's their job, right? And in peacetime, when there's nothing happening, it's like people just basically stop paying attention to government, and government say, well, what about me? Am I not important anymore? You're meant to be listening to me, damn you. How dare you not listen to me? How dare you kind of look the other way or dismiss me, So governments really like to have a crisis where they can engender that kind of dependence of the population on government. And that's what they've been doing over the past 2 years. And it will, like you said, be very useful for stuff that's coming down the pipeline, we think.
Watch the space.
Watch the space, yeah. So nothing else happened?
Well...
That was it?
No, there's more, but...
Was there? Nothing of any note. Djokovic, whatever. That's Everybody knows what's going on with Djokovic. His first name is Novak.
Novak.
Close enough.
Yeah.
Novak Djokovic.
We'll see tomorrow.
Yeah.
Whether they let him play or let him go, period.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. I hear you on the, they've run out of steam with the virus. But the vaccine and the mandatory and follow the orders, that's not going anywhere.
But there's not much point in having requiring a vaccine pass to go to a restaurant when restaurants can't get any food to serve people.
Right.
How many people are going to be using their vaccine pass? You might need your vaccine pass to get a hand out of a bag of wheat from the back of a government supply truck that comes to your town once a week. Or maybe not. I'm pretty sure they just give it to everybody who sticks their hand out. But or to get into the food bank, maybe government food bank, maybe you need a vaccine pass. Who knows? But I think all that's kind of going away. The plans they have are very they're all predicated on their implementation are predicated on them actually being able to do what they think they're going to be able to do, which they're not. Do you know what I mean? So they have a lot of plans that look like this fits with this and it's going in this direction. This will be very useful for this. But at a certain point when chaos breaks out and chaos reigns, it's all falls apart, And just for people who are wondering, this all might sound like grand conspiracy theory, but I'm not saying there's some grand plot plan to do all this. The reason all of this is happening, all the stuff that we talk about happens, is because it's not because of some grand scheming in a back room with people smoking and saying, yes, mwahaha, we will control all the people forever, blah, right? That's not what we're saying.
Yeah.
That happens in a certain sense, but it's simply the nature of the beast, right? Lions get together and plan and plot to pick off or to kill an impala on a hunt. They don't do the mwahaha beforehand, right?
Yeah.
It's the nature of the beast. It's programmed into them.
They act on their instincts.
Farmers with sheep plan to corral sheep and all that kind of stuff, but they don't do it in a Machiavellian mwahaha, right? But if a sheep woke up and became a bit conscious of what was going on, he would very likely go, holy shit, what those farmers are doing? They're talking in a room about how they're going to put us here and put us there and whatever. And it's like...
And inject us with stuff.
Yeah, exactly. They're going to inject us to control us and stuff. But yeah, and it can look that way from the sheep's perspective, but that's not what the farmer's doing. The farmer's simply doing what's expedient and necessary for him to get what he needs to survive. Now, when you're talking about people in positions of power, you're talking about character disturbed people or pathological people who have a certain need or certain thing that they feed on, and they're simply doing what is expedient for them to get what they feel they need to survive. And
from your perspective, they see it as they are the perfect race and we are defective.
Well, everybody has a narrative for it, right? But that's actually what's happening in the broad scheme, in the objective sense. It's the nature of the beast. It's the nature of government. It's the nature of corrupt human beings. It's the nature of pathological human beings. That is the way they act. They respond. They do plan and implement things, but there's no point in looking at it from some kind of... And it's used as a pejorative to kind of say, well, how could everybody be involved in it? How could everybody be part of it and all that kind of stuff? And it's not controlled in that way. It's not all plotted together. They don't all I don't know, however many tens of thousands of people are necessary to, or are part of the infrastructure that, for example, did the COVID thing, right? They didn't all get in a room and plan it all out and sketch it all out as a way to deceive the population. They all acted on their basic human drives and instincts.
Most of
together.
Monkey see, monkey do.
Right.
Like the sage people in the UK saw what Italy did and went, oh. And they'd seen what China did and they went, oh. Yeah. And they said, well,
that would work here. We could do that. That would be useful.
Look at that.
Yeah. And we would do, and the narrative is we'd be helping the population, but behind it, unbeknownst to themselves, is a drive to control and be in the limelight and have the power and tell people what to do. And they feel good at that, but they never admit that to themselves, obviously. And most people don't admit what their own drives are for anything they do. They have a narrative around it. So it's just basic human nature. It's not rocket science. It's not complicated. But a lot of people don't look closely enough at it and analyze it from a kind of objective perspective. A dispassionate perspective.
And the US and its intrigues and geopolitics is also apparently complex. But another way of a kind of mental exercise you can have is if you imagine there was no Russia, well, they would still be imagining up a scenario where they'd be creating a phantom fight in order to create a situation where they need us. They depend on us. The US is like the kind of macro version or representative, the archetypal version of any government anywhere in the world, where they capitalize on a situation and go, well, whatever the most important thing here is I get to keep making decisions.
Yeah.
Everything else is gravy. That's the important thing, is they still keep coming back to me every day to tell them when they can go shopping, how many jobs they need to take. That's important. And the US is like just the top dog of all those governments who's doing it on a global scale through other governments.
Right. And governments and politicians do that initially in a or that hierarchy or political structure in relation to the people is formed naturally and in a genuine way because people have needs. And there are people in society who are smarter, more intelligent, whatever, who are more capable at taking decisions and fulfilling the needs of the population, right? So that's natural and good, right? But the problem is as the people become more competent, what happens to the politicians who have staked their claim, or it's their reason for existing, is to tell other people what to do. When you get attached to that and the feeling of control, it becomes pathologized, and you feel like that it's not so much about helping people anymore, but rather about controlling people. And if you sense that you're not going to be able to control those people anymore because they've become more self-sufficient, well, what do? Well, you start to think about things, how you can create problems for them so they still need you.
Yeah.
Because I'm attached to the idea of needing. There's even a thing like in psychology and family psychology with kind of mothers, there's the devouring mother, and it obviously happens with fathers as well or whatever, but where the mother becomes very attached and very needy in terms of her control and influence over the child, because it's seen as a need. You need me and I feel good. I get something from you needing me. But as the child grows up, doesn't need the mother anymore. It's become an adult. But there's obviously cases where mothers will then, when they see that starting to happen in the child, it becoming more independent, will start to do things that hamper its development and create conditions in it where it continues to need the mother forever.
Yeah.
Because I need you to need me. There's a dynamic there where I'm in a powerful position over you, and I like that position, and I don't want you to grow out of that. So as the global population possibly grows, or a certain section of them anyway starts to grow out of that dependency and need for government to look after them, governments have that similar response. So they don't like it anymore, and they instinctively know that, how do we make sure these people still need us? Well, a good crisis, what would scare them, right? What's scary? What would they feel? What kind of situation can we create where they feel that they're not capable and they need us? It goes back to our often used phrase from V for Vendetta, the Chancellor saying, I want everybody to know why they need us. I want everybody to remember why they need us.
Yeah.
So it's a kind of, it's a general, basic, fairly simple from a psychological point of view truth, but it's weird that's what always gets me, is people don't see it, They see it at local levels, and they willingly accept that that's true at local levels. I even know someone who was like that, but you're not allowed, or they're unable to project it, to broaden it out to a social level or a population level and government, to a mass level. It can exist at a local level of interpersonal two people, but it can't exist on a macro level between government and people, almost like two individuals made up of many people,
Yeah, well, it's partly because the governments have, the state, whatever, has messed with their heads for so long that to do so is to go against God.
Right.
They don't articulate it like that in their minds.
To do what?
Well, God has been replaced, and now the state is God.
Yeah.
And that would be to go against the sanctity of all things. And it's beyond just personal, me and my relationship with mum and dad. Like, now it's like my relationship with the Almighty.
Mm-hmm.
You know, the media said such, everyone's saying it, so that must be true.
Mm-hmm.
That's axiomatic now,
Yeah.
you know.
Yeah, they mess with their heads in the form of information and what they provide. The media and government to present information that's directly opposed to what people feel and see instinctively, and it creates a confusion in people, you know what I mean, where the official source of information or the official source of reality is telling me something opposite to what I see with my own eyes. What do? Do I believe my own eyes, or do I believe the authority? I mean, they're smarter than me. They know, they've got all this information, all these resources to collect information. Surely what they say is true. But when I look, I don't see that. And therein lies the choice, right?
Can't stop the signal, Mel.